There are certain names that become permanently etched into the public consciousness, not because of anything those people chose to do, but because of the storms they were forced to survive. Ellen Nordegren is one of those names. For years, she existed in the public imagination as an accessory to greatness, the strikingly beautiful Swedish woman standing quietly beside the most dominant athlete on the planet. She was elegant, composed, and almost deliberately invisible. And then, in the span of a single weekend in November 2009, her entire world was ripped apart in front of a global audience of billions. The scandal that followed was not just one of the biggest in sports history. It was a cultural earthquake that shook the very foundations of what we thought we knew about fame, marriage, and the carefully constructed illusions that celebrities build around themselves. But here is the question that the headlines never really answered. What happened to Ellen Nordegren after the dust settled? What became of the woman who stood at the epicenter of one of the most explosive public betrayals in modern memory and chose silence over spectacle? The answer, as it turns out, is far more remarkable than anything the tabloids could have scripted. Because Ellen Nordegren did not crumble. She did not retreat into bitterness. She did not sell her story to the highest bidder or rebrand herself for reality television. Instead, she did something that very few people in her position would ever have the discipline or the self-awareness to do. She rebuilt herself entirely on her own terms, quietly, methodically, and without a single camera invited to document the journey. To understand just how extraordinary that transformation is, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to the scandal, not to the divorce, but to the woman herself before any of this ever happened. Ellen Nordegren was born on January 1, 1980, in Stockholm, Sweden, into a family that valued intelligence, discipline, and public service above almost everything else. Her mother, Barbro Holmberg, was not a celebrity or a socialite. She was a serious and respected political figure who eventually rose to serve as Sweden's Minister for Migration and Asylum Policy. Her father, Thomas Nordegren, worked as a radio journalist and foreign correspondent, a man whose career required him to travel the world and engage with complex, real issues. Growing up in that household meant growing up with a certain set of values baked into your identity. Privacy was not just preferred, it was considered a mark of integrity. Hard work was not optional. It was the baseline. Fame for its own sake was never something that entered the conversation. As a teenager and young adult, Ellen was by any measure a striking young woman, and she did some modeling work for Swedish magazines in her earlier years. But crucially, she never pursued it as a serious career. It was a side endeavor, something that helped supplement an income, not a passion or an ambition. She worked in retail. She studied. She carried herself with a groundedness that people around her consistently remarked upon. There was never a hunger for the spotlight in her, and that absence of hunger would later become one of her most defining characteristics, both a source of suffering in the world she entered and ultimately a source of extraordinary strength in the world she built for herself afterward. Her path to the United States came not through any grand plan but through a simple, practical chain of events. She took a job as a nanny for the family of Swedish professional golfer Jesper Parnevik and his wife Mia, and relocated to Florida. It was through the Parnevik family's social circle, deeply embedded in the world of professional golf, that Ellen was first introduced to Tiger Woods. And by that point, Tiger Woods was not merely a professional golfer. He was a phenomenon of a scale that sports had rarely seen before or since. Multiple major championships, a billion-dollar personal brand, global recognition that transcended the sport itself. He was, in the truest sense of the phrase, the biggest name in the room, every room. By multiple accounts, Ellen was not immediately swept off her feet. Jesper Parnevik himself later confirmed in interviews that she had reservations about entering the world that surrounded an athlete of Tiger's stature. She understood instinctively what that life would mean: the scrutiny, the loss of anonymity, the constant presence of cameras and public interest. That instinct, as it turned out, was entirely correct. But Tiger was persistent, and what followed was a genuine romance that took root quietly before it became one of the most watched relationships in the sporting world. They became engaged in 2003 during a trip to South Africa, and married in October 2004 at the Sandy Lane Resort in Barbados, a ceremony of extraordinary exclusivity, with security keeping the media firmly at bay. The years that followed seemed, from the outside, to represent a perfect life. They lived in a massive, carefully secured estate in Windermere, Florida. Ellen gave birth to their daughter Sam Alexis Woods in 2007 and their son Charlie Axel Woods in 2009. She embraced motherhood with the same quiet commitment she brought to everything else. She declined interviews consistently, even when offered significant money to speak. She avoided the social scene that many athletes' partners inhabit. She was, in the eyes of the public, a devoted mother living a gilded life in the background of her husband's extraordinary career. What was not visible, what could not have been visible from the outside, was that beneath that surface, something was catastrophically wrong. The events of Thanksgiving weekend 2009 are by now broadly known, but the human reality of what Ellen experienced that night is something that no headline ever fully captured. In the early hours of November 27th, a confrontation reportedly took place at the family home after Ellen discovered text messages on Tiger's phone that suggested infidelity. What followed ended with Tiger's SUV crashed into a tree near their driveway and the beginning of a media storm that would consume the next several years of both their lives. In the days and weeks that followed, the scope of Tiger's betrayal became clear in the most public and brutal way imaginable. Women came forward in growing numbers. Voicemails and text messages were published. The details were dissected on every television network, every tabloid, and every internet forum on the planet. Tiger's carefully constructed image, built on a foundation of discipline and focus and excellence, collapsed almost overnight. Corporate sponsors reacted swiftly. Accenture ended a partnership that had run for years. Gillette reduced his presence in their campaigns. Gatorade pulled a product that had literally been named after him. The cultural reckoning was swift and total. And in the middle of all of it, Ellen said almost nothing. That silence was not weakness. Anyone who interpreted it that way fundamentally misread the woman. Ellen Nordegren had grown up in a household where dignity was expressed through composure, where the loudest statement you could make was the decision not to perform your pain for an audience. While the media camped outside her home and photographers tracked her movements to grocery stores and playgrounds and her children's school events, she maintained a steadiness that struck many observers as almost impossible. She attended to her children. She moved through her days. She did not grant the media the spectacle it so desperately wanted. She did eventually break her silence in a single, carefully chosen interview with People magazine, and what she said in that conversation revealed everything important about who she was. She spoke plainly about having been completely blindsided. She confirmed that she had not known, had not suspected, and had not quietly accepted any of it. She described the revelation as a world collapsing, saying that it felt as though the life she believed she was living had never actually existed. She spoke about the word betrayal feeling insufficient for what she experienced. And she spoke, perhaps most remarkably, about working toward forgiveness, not for Tiger's sake alone, but as a necessary step in her own healing process. She described forgiveness as the final stage of grief, something she was working toward deliberately and thoughtfully. That interview stands as one of the most dignified public statements made by anyone in a comparable situation. There was no performance of victimhood. There was no attempt to win sympathy or to direct public anger. There was simply a woman telling the truth about what she had experienced and making clear that she intended to move forward. Then she went quiet again. And this time, the quiet lasted much longer. In August 2010, Ellen filed for divorce. The legal proceedings were handled with the same discretion that had characterized her entire public presence. A brief joint statement confirmed that the marriage was over and that both parties were committed to co-parenting their children in a respectful and child-focused way. Reports at the time estimated the financial settlement at somewhere in the region of $100 million, a figure that was never officially confirmed but was widely cited as one of the largest celebrity divorce settlements on record. But what became clear very quickly was that the money, however substantial, was not the story. The story was what Ellen chose to do with the freedom she now had. When she enrolled at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida, many people were surprised. At a moment when the entire media landscape was waiting to see how the wronged ex-wife of the world's most famous golfer would reinvent herself, the answer was a university classroom. No clothing line. No memoir deal. No reality television. Just coursework, textbooks, and a genuine commitment to earning a degree in psychology. She attended classes alongside students who were sometimes young enough to be unaware of who she was, and she approached her studies with the same seriousness she had always brought to anything she undertook. In 2014, Ellen graduated from Rollins College with a grade point average of 3.96, placing her at the top of her class and earning her the Outstanding Senior Award, a distinction given not just for academic performance but for character and contribution to the broader college community. At the graduation ceremony, She delivered a brief speech about resilience and the value of education as a path to self-understanding. It was a moment that told you everything about how completely she had redirected her energy. The woman who had spent years defined in the public mind by her husband's achievements and her husband's failures had spent 4 years quietly building an identity rooted entirely in her own intellectual effort and her own hard-won growth. Her interest in psychology was not accidental and not merely academic. The discipline gave her tools to understand and articulate the trauma she had experienced, the grief, the disorientation, and the long process of rebuilding a coherent sense of self after a betrayal that had been both deeply personal and conducted in full public view. She has spoken about the importance of therapy in her own recovery and has expressed a sustained commitment to mental health awareness as a cause she cares about deeply, even if she pursues that commitment away from any kind of public platform. At the same time she was completing her degree, Ellen was also quietly demonstrating a striking aptitude for an entirely different domain. In 2011, she purchased an oceanfront property in North Palm Beach, Florida, for approximately $12 million. Rather than simply move into the existing structure, she had it demolished and rebuilt from the ground up, overseeing the design of a new home that reflected her own aesthetic sensibility, a blend of the clean Scandinavian minimalism she had grown up surrounded by and the open, light-filled character appropriate to coastal Florida living. The project took years and required the kind of patient, detailed engagement that most people would find exhausting. Ellen found it absorbing and purposeful. In 2020, she sold that property for $28.6 million. The sale represented not just a remarkable financial return but a demonstration that her instincts, her patience, and her willingness to invest significant time and thought into something before presenting it to the world produced genuinely outstanding results. It was one of the largest residential real estate transactions in Palm Beach County that year. She did not announce it with a press release or a social media post. There is no verified social media presence associated with Ellen Nordegren. The sale simply happened, was documented in public records, and was noted by those paying attention. That pattern of achieving significant things without performing them for public consumption is perhaps the most consistent thread running through everything she has done since her divorce. In 2017, it became known that Ellen had begun a relationship with Jordan Cameron, a former NFL tight end who had played for the Cleveland Browns and the Miami Dolphins before retiring from professional football due to the cumulative effects of multiple concussions. Cameron, like Ellen, had stepped away from a high-profile career at a relatively young age and was navigating life outside the spotlight with a quietness and groundedness that seemed to complement her own approach to privacy and personal growth. By all accounts, the relationship